we're going to move now into our next section, which is biodiversity and biodiversity decline. And if I can open my laptop, apologies. Yeah, we're only live to anyone who looks in. So this session, we're going to look at some of the concepts that were introduced in May by Robert Watson and other speakers that first day we were together in Dublin Castle. And so Professor Tasman Crowe, who is Director of the Earth Institute at UCD and Chair of the National Biodiversity Forum, he gave a brilliant introduction to our marine biodiversity, and today he's going to outline the fundamentals of ecology with a presentation that's co-written by Professor Jenny McElwain and Dr. James Moran as well. So this is like an Ecology 101 lesson. So it's going to show us what exactly supports our biodiversity and what threatens biodiversity. And they're the basic tenets that we need to take with us as we progress through the meetings. We wanted to start here because we figured that if we start looking at all the threats and all the challenges, etc., without really going back to the fundamental at the very beginning, we mightn't be able to connect all the jigsaw pieces. So please welcome Taz to give us our brief Ecology 101. Thanks, Taz.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks very much indeed, and absolutely it's a co-authored presentation with Jenny and James, and hopefully it follows on nicely from that wonderful introduction that sort of set us thinking in very different ways about what we're doing here, I think. So in the initial sessions, we established that biodiversity is essentially the mixture of species and habitats and their kind of relative abundances in relation to each other. And we established also that the loss of biodiversity is partly about the gradual and localized decline of many habitats and species, which is happening all around the world, including in Ireland. But it's also about those that are at particular risk of extinction because they're under persistent pressure and their numbers are becoming very, very low. And there are a number of lists of such habitats and species. For example, as part of European directives, but also at an international level through initiatives like the IUCN Red Lists. And they use all the available evidence to categorize species into different levels of kind of endangerment, and the worst of those categories is critically endangered when there's just a few individuals left, either in the wild or in captivity. And we tend to think, when we talk about endangered species, about the kind of high-profile international species like panda bears and big cats, but there are many species on IUCN Red Lists in Ireland as well. And some of those species are actually unique to Ireland, some species and subspecies, I should say. So, for example, there are 20 species of plant that we only find in Ireland, and we have our own subspecies of hare, although its status as a subspecies is debated. And these kinds of species are of particular concern because if they're lost here, then they're lost everywhere. So to understand how habitats and species become endangered, and indeed how best we can prevent them from going extinct, we need to understand a few important principles in ecology. So we want to kind of scratch below the surface a little bit of the biodiversity and the ecosystems that we've been talking about. And so ecology is the study of the distribution and abundance of species and indeed habitats, and how they interact with each other and with their environment. And we also need to get a better handle on some of those threats that we've been talking about that are causing their ranges and abundances to become reduced. And that's what this talk is going to be about. And so to explain those principles, this Ecology 101, we're going to focus on a single species as a primary example, the natterjack toad. And in fact, although this species is rare in Ireland and its conservation status is bad, I should point out that it does occur in other parts of Europe, so it's not one of the endemic species that I mentioned before. Still, our primary concern in this space, I guess, is to do with the population of the species, right? So that's one kind of level of organization in ecology. And we're observing, what we're observing is a reduction in the total population size in a given area, be it a locality or a nation or a region of nations, or indeed the whole world. And that population may dip below what's called a minimum viable population, when there are just too few individuals or they're too widely dispersed to sustain the population going forward. And that's what we're trying to understand. How do we get to that point, and how do we stop that from happening? So, and on the face of it, this is essentially an imbalance between the number of births into the population and the number of deaths out of the population, although migration and movement also play an important part between subpopulations especially. And the answer, and so we want to understand what's causing that imbalance to occur. And the answer lies both inside the organisms themselves and through factors external to it in terms of its biological, chemical, and physical environment. So first we need to understand what's going on inside the organisms. So we need to understand how their bodies are working to enable them to live in the environment and to set limits to where they can occur in terms of taking in oxygen, tolerating variation in temperature and moisture and salinity, to digest food, to use nutrients, and to deal with infections and diseases and toxins and so on. And different individuals actually vary considerably in their tolerances and their inner workings, and indeed their genetic makeup. And that's another layer of biodiversity that we haven't really talked about yet, but which is also very important in giving species the adaptability to persist in a changing environment. So that's also an important feature of biodiversity. We might also consider what each individual as a whole does, such as their behaviors, which influence how they engage with each other and with the environment, and how they reproduce. Organisms have life history strategies, which means that they often have different requirements for different aspects and stages of their lives. So our toads, for example, may need wetland areas to forage on for particular kinds of food. They may need shallow ponds to breed in, and rocks and logs to seek refuge under. And their eggs and tadpoles may need particular depth and quality of water to thrive in. And so if we're concerned with conserving the species, we need to protect each of its life history stages and make provision for all aspects of their life. Of course, populations of one species don't exist in isolation, and this was alluded to earlier on. They interact with other species as part of a community. So different species may provide food or habitat, or they may compete with them or prey on them, and they can have significant effects on the populations. So toads, for example, are preyed upon by birds like this heron and mammals like foxes, and their tadpoles are preyed upon by fish and some pretty scary invertebrates as well, like this dragonfly larva that's consuming a tadpole there. The communities live as part of an ecosystem, which is the combined biological and non-biological components of the environment. And the ecosystems essentially kind of capture energy, usually through photosynthesis by plants, so the process of capturing sunlight energy, and that energy then moves through the system essentially as sugars and fats and starches, as organisms consume each other, and they are also using and consuming other materials in their day-to-day activities. And that's the kind of those are the processes by which the system is productive, through which it recycles water and nutrients and wastes and so on. And we also depend on these kinds of processes for our life support. And when ecosystems are damaged, for example, through the reductions or loss of particular species or habitats, then that also makes them less efficient and less able to sustain themselves or to support us. And it's worth mentioning that some species play particularly important roles in particular habitats and ecosystems. For example, especially the kinds of species that provide habitat, like trees we've mentioned and seaweeds and so on. And these are often called keystone or foundation species. Each ecosystem, sort of defined ecosystem, a sort of pond or a woodland or a field, lives in a mosaic in a wider landscape as part of a wider landscape, and they can interact with other ecosystems in that landscape. So this is another level at which we need to think about the natural world. So for example, a pond or a wetland ecosystem like that one may be next to a woodland, and it may process some of the leaves and twigs that fall out of that woodland. It may have insect larvae living in it, like that dragonfly larva, which may hatch into adults that could then live in the woodland and be preyed upon by birds in that woodland. So what this means is that things that we do to one ecosystem will also influence what happens in other ecosystems as part of that mosaic. And all of this takes place in the context of the global biosphere, which Jenny talked about in response to one of the questions. So where high-level changes in things like atmospheric composition, ocean circulation, and climate strongly influence what goes on in different parts of the world and are influenced by the living world as well, as Jenny said. So our toads, for example, may have a defined range of kind of countries and regions that they are able to exist in, and that's set by the patterns of rainfall and temperature on the planet's surface, and also by the habitat requirements and tolerances of the toads themselves. And of course, these ranges are now changing as our planet is changing. All right, so species are being moved from the areas where they currently exist because the surface of the planet is changing. And that can have very important consequences. So in summary, each species lives within a complex environment, and its populations are influenced by a wide range of both internal and external factors. Okay? And with this knowledge, it's perhaps easier to make sense of why the big 5 threats to global biodiversity that were outlined before are having their effects, and what we might do about it. So just to kind of recap, the big 5 threats that we've talked about already are, as identified by a number of international bodies, particularly the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, would identify habitat loss, overexploitation, pollution, invasive species, and climate change as the biggest influences, negative influences on biodiversity at the moment. So just to go through them, habitat loss is being driven by our ever-increasing need for food, raw materials, and infrastructure, so that we're converting natural habitats into agricultural land, cultivated forests, houses, roads, runways, railways, factories, seawalls, and so on. And this constitutes an incremental erosion of the natural environment. You know, and often each individual loss may seem quite small, but of course they're all accumulating as we go forward. And we tend to think of this on a global scale. We hear statistics about the loss of rainforests, for example. And last year, for instance, we lost 11 million hectares of rainforest globally, which is about the size of a football field every 4 seconds. But this is also happening here and in Europe. The habitat is being incrementally replaced by the expansion of our footprint. And of course, when you bring that back to think about our toads, this means that some of the wetland areas that it needs to live and feed and breed in are being replaced by golf courses and housing estates and so on, which means that there's less environment for it to live in, which inevitably means that the population will shrink under that kind of pressure. And in fact, it's not just the outright loss of the habitat that causes difficulties. It's also its fragmentation into smaller chunks, which you can see in these kind of 2 diagrams, 2 images on the right-hand side there. So if the habitat chunks become too small, or the gaps between them become too big, species are not able to kind of move between patches, and they're not able to sustain populations properly. Overexploitation refers to the harvesting of wild species, and the classic example that's most relevant to Ireland is fisheries. And indeed, there are sustainable fisheries, particularly small-scale artisanal coastal fisheries, but many large-scale fisheries on an industrial scale are overexploited, and strict management is needed to conserve them. Atlantic cod, for example, are actually listed in the IUCN Red List as an endangered species. So these are species that are being driven towards extinction if that process is not managed. And this is due to the direct removal of individuals from the population. Okay, so this is happening at the population level. Many more fish are being taken out of the system than are being kind of born back into it. That's fundamentally what's going on. It's also worth bearing in mind that fisheries also can cause habitat loss and damage, both on the seabed and in terms of bycatch taken in the nets themselves. And as such, it's important to think of fisheries in the context of the ecosystems they're embedded in. And this is part of the thinking around how to best manage fisheries. So on to pollution. This is contamination of the environment, both with physical debris, like litter, including plastics, and indeed the kind of dust that falls off your tires on the road, but also with an excess of chemicals. And many polluting chemicals are directly toxic to animals. So they might just kill our toads or the things that they feed upon when they find their way into the waterways. Pesticides are classic examples of this and often affect species that they were not intended to affect. And these kinds of toxins work by disrupting the inner workings of organisms. So they may kill them outright or just gradually prevent them from getting enough oxygen or nutrition or interfere with their behavior, their feeding patterns, which means that their condition is lowered and they're less able to cope with other pressures that may come to bear on them. And so the population then is gradually undermined. Some toxins actually interfere directly with the reproductive system and can lead to the organisms to sterility. So again, with a very marked effect on populations. Another form of pollution that's causing widespread damage to ecosystems is nutrient pollution, which is an excess of some of the key nutrients that everything does need to grow. When we're artificially enhancing the quantities in the system of things like nitrogen and phosphorus, this can cause rapid growth of plants and microalgae, which can kind of clog the system up, like the slide there. So obviously you can see that that's not a great place for toads anymore. And things get worse when those plants and microalgae die and sink to the bottom and they decompose. And that process of decomposition sucks oxygen out of the system. The decomposing microbes use oxygen in their metabolism. And so that makes the system inhospitable to animals like fish and invertebrates, and indeed toads and their eggs and tadpoles. And this process is called eutrophication, and it's happening at the ecosystem level. The whole system is being affected by it. And sewage runoff and runoff from agricultural land are the two biggest sources of nutrients into the environment, and this is very well recognized, and there are a number of EU directives in place to try to reduce those inputs and clean up our aquatic ecosystems. So this idyllic scene on Achill Island looks like a classic Irish landscape, but in fact nearly all the vegetation that you can see in that picture is not native to Ireland. Right, so it's made up of species that are replacing our native species and altering communities and ecosystem processes. Japanese knotweed is particularly infamous as it's extremely hard to control and can do serious damage to roads and buildings, in fact, as well as to the natural environment, to the natural system. And the marine environment also has some nasty new additions from overseas, such as this sea squirt called didymnum, which carpets hard surfaces, smothers other living things, and actually protects itself by secreting acid on its surface. Climate in Ireland has warmed by 0.9 degrees C since 1900, in line with the global increase of about a degree centigrade. And there are many mechanisms by which this warming then is changing the system and having impacts on biodiversity. In terms of increasing temperatures, changes in seasonality, changes in rainfall patterns and extreme events, and all of these can place pressure on the functioning of systems, of ecosystems. For example, over this period, scientists have observed changes in the timing of life cycle events in birds, insects, amphibians, and plants. And changes in those events which are not synchronized among species lead to mismatches in the food availability and the demand for that food. So, for example, birds like blue tits, time their breeding to make sure that there's the maximum. They've evolved to time their breeding to make sure there's the maximum availability of insect food for their young, which they need to feed. But now the insects are kind of most abundant at different times from when they were. So you're getting this kind of mismatch, making it more difficult for birds to raise their offspring. And there's a range of possible future climates predicted under different emissions pathways. And you know very much about this story, I'm sure. And you will have become aware of the kinds of things that will happen if temperature increases by 2 degrees or even 1.5 degrees. And a future changing climate will have its effects in Ireland as well. So, for example, our coastlines would be impacted, are being impacted indirectly through sea level rise and coastal erosion, which means a loss of those coastal habitats. Many of our most unique and important habitats require a high level of rainfall, for example, peatlands, and future climate scenarios for Ireland predict drier summers, which will also have the effect of making an increase in fire risk, which we've been seeing all across Europe, especially this summer. And these changes can also make our systems more susceptible to the other threats. So we're seeing that invasive species from warmer regions are being able to become established more easily and live in northern cooler regions because of the influence of climate change. So it lays us more open to those kind of invaders. So a pretty bleak picture, I guess, those last few points. And we are working hard to understand the range of those threats and how they interact with each other, because they don't work in isolation, and how they influence ecosystems through those levels of organization that I described within organisms, at the organism individuals themselves, at population, community, and ecosystem level. And that research can help us understand which species, habitats, and ecosystems are most sensitive to particular threats and pressures, and how able they are to recover after they've been impacted, which is their resilience, all right, that capacity to recover and persist. And so underwater merle beds like this one on the sort of left-hand side there, which are kind of like coral reefs, but they're actually made of a hard kind of seaweed, which we have in Ireland, are very fragile, very sensitive, particularly to physical disturbance, okay? And they also take a very long time to recover when they're severely damaged. Whereas other systems can recover quite quickly after being damaged, as long as the damage is not too severe and is not inflicted too frequently, all right? So the regimes of damage are important as well. Over the years, ecological research combined with other forms of knowledge, so I'm not kind of holding up the science as the only way that we come to understand these processes. There's a lot of indigenous knowledge that helps us to get to grips with what's going on. And this combination of approaches has yielded important insights into how systems respond to disturbances. So, for example, we know that some degree of disturbance can actually help to promote biodiversity. So on this rocky shore, you can see different patches of different kinds of habitat, different colors on the shore. Each one of those has a different mixture of species in it, and those patches are maintained by natural processes, physical disturbance, quite often associated with the kind of normal storms that we would expect in the scheme of things. Low levels of grazing as well can also promote biodiversity. So this small herd of Highland cattle was actually introduced on purpose into a very large urban green space in Copenhagen with a view that they would help to create a more complex environment with areas of longer grass and areas of shorter grass, which enables other plants to thrive and get to the light and get to the nutrients, which otherwise would become dominated just by long grasses. So all in all, ecosystems can be likened to complex machines, with each species playing important roles in making it all work. And in a famous analogy, the species have been likened to the rivets holding an airplane together. There is some redundancy. You can afford to lose some species in a given area and the airplane will keep flying. But if you lose too many species, or you lose critical species, critical keystone species, and lose irreplaceable functions, then the airplane will crash. And the evidence makes it clear that that is the trajectory that we're on. All right, so it's not called a biodiversity emergency for nothing. And obviously that's not what we want, and it's really urgent that we take the steps now to prevent that from happening. But rather than leave it on such a bleak note, we'd just like to emphasize that as well as helping us understand what's causing biodiversity loss and what the consequences might be, ecologists and other researchers and wider society can also help to inform solutions. All right? So the development of the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, for example, was led by ecologists and is full of practical, evidence-based advice on how to manage ecosystems for wildlife. And ecological knowledge also underpins Ireland's successful programme of peatland restoration and will inform the expansion of Ireland's network of marine protected areas, for example, and there are many other examples which we're going to hear something about, I'm sure. So, as such, although our ecosystems and our effects on them are extremely complicated, and we have much, much more to learn, we do already have sufficient understanding to be able to take some important steps towards reducing the impact of the Big Five and indeed reversing some of the damage that they're doing. And sometimes it's the political will or the design, implementation or uptake of policy which is really the limiting step for taking impactful action. And that's a whole nother story, and one involving many more forms of knowledge and dialogue, and one that is also going to be very important for your deliberations and recommendations, and you'll be hearing much more about that as the talks progress. So thanks very much indeed.